This video will step through the functionality for each of the fields in Terracon's GINT CPT system. Terracon's been able to do a lot and increase the functionality of the GINT software, but along with that increased functionality comes an increase in the number of input fields. Hopefully this video will cut down on the learning curve associated with the CPT functionality of the system. So if we go through the project tab first, the basic project information fields are going to function the same way as typical soil test boring. So if we flip over to an example log, you can see that the project name, client name, test information, etc. is all populated and looks pretty similar to the Terracon's boring log. So if you choose not to enter a project location, the city and state will actually just bump up and replace that on the log. And as you know from the soil test boring logs, this architect, engineer, field, and location are optional. So if the user leaves those blank, this line, as well as this field here, will just not show. And as we move along, it's going to be really important to note this light green field down at the bottom. This includes notes and hints for each individual field, and is also going to give you some idea whether or not this field applies to CPTs or not. So as you can see, this variable column 1 header field does not apply to CPTs. It's not going to impact the printed log at all. So there's a note down here that says it's not applicable to CPT or DMP logs. Same thing with the variable column 2 header and the lab variable column header. Now we get down to these depth log per page fields. Typically for your soil test borings, this is where you would enter how much depth is going to be on each individual page, whether that be 20 feet, and that needs to be entered for each individual project. However, for CPT and DMT projects, this is actually automated. So the system is going to go through and find your deepest boring and automatically set your depth, the depth of your CPT page to that. This is only an override. So if for some reason you want to split up a 100-foot boring into 2 pages, this is where you would come in and enter 50 feet. For most projects, you can just leave that field blank for CPTs. Your output units, that's really only going to be for soil test borings. Your units for your CPTs will be selected when you import the data. Water unit weight and coefficient of consol do not apply to CPTs. And your logo, this is very important. I've seen a lot of logs where people forget to select a logo. The Terracon logo will still display. This is to include the address and name of the individual office. Your draft, if you check this Boolean field, a watermark draft will be printed on the logs, just like soil test boring logs. Recovery units does not apply to CPTs, nor does compression strength. The show northing and easting field does apply. This is how you would show your northing and easting on a log, as you can see here. So even if you enter a northing and easting for a specific test, unless you check that box, it will not print on the log. The show variable columns 1 and 2 does not apply to CPTs, nor does the following several fields that I've highlighted. All of your exhibit and appendix letter and number overrides are going to function the same way for CPTs as they do for borings. Your boring log appendix letter override defaults to A, but if you enter a B here, the logs will print as B dash whatever. Exhibit A override refers to your field exploration description. reference, typically that's going to default to A-3. If your field exploration description is somewhere else, this is where you would write that override. Appendix B override, this refers to laboratory information. There are no references on the CPT log to lab, so this does not apply. The Appendix C override does apply, however. This, on the CPT log, there's a reference to the CPT general notes, and that's going to refer to Appendix C, unless you come in here and override that with B or D or whatever the case may be. You can also choose to not show individual references. If you check this box, your field exploration description reference will not show. As I mentioned earlier, there is no lab reference on CPT logs, so this field does not apply. However, this do not show general notes does apply to CPT logs. And this last field, if you click this, all references to specific exhibits or appendices will not display. Sample ID does not apply to CPTs. That concludes the project table. If we jump over to the borehole table, we'll go from there. Much of this information, as discussed earlier for CPTs, is going to be automatically imported. That includes the boring ID number, termination depth, type, and the dates as long as they're entered in the field. You can choose to change your boring ID name for a CPT. I think this one automatically imported like that, and I chose to keep everything uniform by entering a dash. Refusal does apply to CPTs. If you just click the refusal box, instead of saying CPT terminated at 52.2 feet, the log will list CPT refused at 52.2 feet. If you want to write a specific reason for refusal, you can do so here. And your GINT point sort, this is just a sorting override within the GINT system, but it also has the functionality to override the exhibit number for the individual log. So typically when I print a log, the first one is going to be listed as A-1. But I say I want to list my logs all as A-4 for CPTs. I could come in here and put a 4 in that field for my SCPT-1. Now when I print it, that reference, that exhibit reference will be A-4. Jumping over to the drill rig option, you can add the CPT rigs to your drill rig drop-down menus, but you can also just type in an override as well. Advanced method does not apply to CPT logs, nor does hammer type or abandonment method. The driller, however, does apply, and this is listed in the bottom right-hand corner. Text will not populate on a CPT log, nor will an engineer or geologist. But these are useful for in-house record keeping if there is an engineer on site. Surface elevation will populate on the log if it is entered. You can choose to show a little plus or minus and also an approximate elevation. Instead of just showing elevation, it will say approximate elevation if you click this elevation plus minus Boolean field. You can also enter a note to describe where your elevations were pulled from. That will populate down at the bottom. You can see optional user-defined elevation note is listed right there. If nothing is entered, then nothing will show up on the log. Latitude, longitude, if anything is entered there, will automatically populate. And northing, easting, as we described earlier, you not only need to enter the data here, but also click Show Northing and Easting. If you do so, both your lat long and your northing and easting will show up on your log. If you just have northing and easting, that will just show as well. Same with station and offset. If anything is entered in either of these, then that will display on the log. And the alternate location field is an override for this reference, this test location reference here. This typically references your test location plan, and at times it's appropriate to override that. In this case, we'll say C Exhibit A-3, as opposed to the default, which is C Exhibit A-2, and that will show if this field is left blank. Now, as we talked about earlier, you are tempted to enter water depth information for CPTs in these several fields that I've highlighted. However, these do not apply to CPTs. If you try to enter any information in these for a CPT test, when you try to save it, you'll get an error message. Leave these blank for CPTs. Well, anything you enter here does not impact the log. General notes 1 and 2 are areas that the practitioner can communicate some information about the test on the log. It would be appropriate to talk about surface conditions or pre-drilling or anything else that you want to communicate there. And these will populate in bold in the bottom left-hand corner. If these are left blank, the information below it will just bump up and replace it. ASTM also requires that we list what type of a reaction force we used during the test, whether it was dead weight of the rig or we used some type of auger anchors to help with additional reaction force. So for CPTs, that's going to be important to include that information. The rest of these tabs in the main group do not apply to CPTs. So after you're finished completing the information in the borehole tab, you can move over to the CPT tab. So you can choose your boring ID number, which is pre-populated, and as discussed in other videos, entering your water depth triggers the calculation of all the parameters. If you choose this Boolean field and identify it as a measured water depth, when you print the log, you can see down here in the bottom left-hand corner, it's going to default to 8.3 feet estimated water depth. However, if we choose that field measured water depth, when you print the log, it will say measured water depth as opposed to estimated. Next field is the probe ID. This is important not just as a reference on the log, but the system uses that probe ID to pull the calibration data for that cone and net area ratio and uses that in the calculations for the CPT parameters. So this is important that you get this right and accurate for the cone. The file name doesn't apply to the log. This is just a way to keep track of where the file was imported from. The units field, again, does not apply to the log. It's just a record of the system of units for the project. And that's read-only, so it's just a record for you to keep track of. The adjacent borehole field, as covered in another video, is a way to specify an adjacent boring that will display on your CPT log. This example includes that. You can see the graphic from that adjacent test is plotted on the CPT log. If this is left blank, no adjacent boring graphic will display. That brings us to our CPT report setup table. We've already discussed in other videos how to customize your correlative parameters report using these first 6 fields. These are left blank. The default correlative parameters report will print, but the user can always come in and customize the parameters by choosing as few as 3 parameters to print, and you can also identify up to 6. This MKT field, that is a geographical or soil-specific constant in the correlation for shear strength. 14 is kind of a middle-of-the-road value, and that's what is defaulted. However, especially for larger projects, or if you have a lot of CPT data in your area, it'd be a good idea to get a little more accurate shear strength correlations by modifying that MKT value. Again, the CPT input units is just a record of the system of units currently in use in the project. There are several Boolean fields to choose to hide the dual plots. Your standard log is going to print with not only your main scale for tip resistance, for example, with the main red, but also prints with this light gray 1/10 scale. This is really helpful because a lot of times the CPT data, you're going to have high peaks in your data, and it's hard to identify actual values for the lower measured areas. This allows the user to not only identify that the refusal occurred at close to 380 or 400 TSF, but also in this really soft layer that, that's probably about 12 TSF in this area. So it's just a way to communicate both high measured areas and soft areas. Same thing with sleeve resistance. And N60 also includes that same dual plot. However, if you want to ever remove that, you can choose these fields to hide those dual plots, and that will just plot your main single scale. CPT report setup also includes all of your maximum and minimum overrides. Again, system's going to go through and find the maximum data and assign the maximum scale based on that. However, if there's ever a reason to override that, this is where you would do it. You can also choose to hide your groundwater depth or hide your hydrostatic plot. This may be useful if you don't want to communicate to the client a groundwater plot or groundwater depth because it's not very well known, and it could open Terracon up to some liability. So that way you can show your pore pressure measurement without the plot and or your hydrostatic line. If you choose not to display your groundwater depth, it's not only going to hide this logo, but it will also hide this groundwater depth reference down at the bottom. It's more of the same, and then down at the bottom there's an option to hide your adjacent boring graphic. This would be used in the case that you would want to specify an adjacent soil boring and list it up here in the upper right as an adjacent test, but you don't want to display the graphic on the CPT log. So if you choose this field, it will display up in the title box, but this graphic will not display. Now if we switch over to dissipation tests, we've already discussed this in another video, how to import and use this data, and same with CPT seismic shear waves. Just a note on the seismic shear wave velocities, the system defaults to geophone and source offsets. However, it's important that the practitioner modify these as is needed. I mentioned earlier about the probe ID and how it pulls calibration data. Let's touch quickly on how to enter calibration data for a specific cone. We're going to go to your data design and library data. At that point, you can use the drop-down menu to select CPT calibrations. You'll see a list of all of your current probe IDs and the calibration data for that. You can either modify calibration data for an existing cone or enter a new probe ID, and that way the GINT system will know to pull this calibration data and automatically populate it on the logs when that probe ID is selected for a given test. Lastly, let's talk about some of the output options. The Terracon GINT CPT system has the option to print both your basic standard CPT report, which includes your ASTM required data, and this is the report that's going to be included in every project and every report. This includes your tip, sleeve, friction ratio, pore pressure, and soil behavior type. Optionally, also on there is the seismic shear waves and an adjacent boring graphic. The other option is to print the correlate parameters report, which we've already gone over how to print the default and customize that as the practitioner desires. We've also touched on the different graphs you can print of CPT data. All of the CPT graphs are preceded by letters CPT. That way everything's kept in one spot. You can print parameter graphs, which, for instance, would print tip resistance on one graph for all of the tests in the current project. You can also print dissipation results, both on a semi-log scale and a square root of time scale, and a shear wave velocity profile. And that's a basic overview of each field's functionality within the GINT CPT system. Hopefully that was helpful.